Okay, let's unpack this. We all navigate decisions constantly, right?
All the time, yeah.
And we've all heard that framework, the one Daniel Kahneman really brought to the mainstream. System 1, System 2.
The quick, intuitive system 1
Uh-huh.
and the slow, more deliberate system 2. Yeah, it's become this incredibly useful lens, hasn't it, for understanding those sort of two main gears in our cognitive engine.
Totally. But, the human mind is just incredibly complex. And some researchers, some thinkers, they're starting to ask, is that two-system model really enough?
That's exactly the question, isn't it? What if there's like a layer above system 1 and system 2?
A supervisory layer.
Yeah, something that's not just about reacting or analyzing, but about actually managing those processes themselves. These thinkers are suggesting we might need a third layer, a system 3, they're calling it sometimes.
To capture the real richness of how we decide things, especially the tricky stuff.
Exactly, especially when things get complicated or, involve long-term goals, planning, that kind of thing.
Okay, and that's our mission for this deep dive. We've got a stack of sources here, research papers, some theoretical articles, even some more accessible takes on this.
Mm,
And we want to really get to the bottom of what this supposed third system is meant to do. How does it stack up against cognitive processes we already know quite a bit about?
And the big question, is it a genuinely new breakthrough? A whole new way of understanding the mind?
Or is it more of an evolution, like refining the ideas we already have?
Right, because often the folks proposing a system 3 are trying to tackle a very real problem, something we all experience.
Yeah.
The gap between figuring out the right decision, often with that careful system 2 reasoning, and then actually, doing it, following through.
Oh, I know that gap well. So well. It's when System 2 does all the hard work, lays out the logic, tells you exactly what you should do.
And then poof,
Yeah.
you just don't know.
Or System 1 yanks you back towards what's easy or feels good right now.
Mm.
Or maybe the motivation just evaporates.
It feels like something's missing in that chain, doesn't it? Between the analysis and the action.
Definitely. And this idea of a third system, something to maybe bridge that gap, it seems to be popping up in some interesting places.
It really is. You see, it talked about not just in the deep cognitive science papers trying to tweak dual process models,
Right.
but also in things like leadership books, strategy guide stuff, dealing with actually implementing complex plans out in the world.
Makes sense.
And even in discussions about imagination, how we plan for the future, how that guides what we do now, it shows this isn't just some academic puzzle. It speaks to that feeling we have about how hard it can be to make our actions line up with what we've reasoned out.
Okay, so let's get a clearer picture from these sources.
Yeah.
What is this proposed System 3? Like, what's its job description?
Well, like I mentioned, the main idea is it's a meta layer. It operates on the other two systems.
Above them.
Yeah, think of it that way. If system 1 is the fast, automatic stuff, and system 2 is the slow, deliberate calculation, system 3 is often described as the oversight, the management layer.
Okay, the manager. So what's on the manager's to-do list?
According to the different proposals and the sources, it's got a pretty broad scope. It's described as, first, monitoring what System 1 and System 2 are doing.
Keeping an eye on them.
Exactly. Then evaluating their outputs. Like, is System 1's quick judgment actually appropriate here? Or is System 2 getting bogged down in analysis paralysis?
Okay.
Crucially, it's supposedly involved in deciding which system or which process should be in the driver's seat in a given situation.
Choosing the right tool for the job.
Right. And maybe the most talked about function. It's proposed to ensure that the decisions we make, especially the careful, reasoned ones from System 2, actually get implemented, that we follow through.
So it's like the coach and the captain. It watches
Uh-huh.
the play between the gut and the brain, calls the next move, and then makes sure the team executes.
That's a pretty good analogy, yeah. It's about strategic control and making sure things happen. But it's important to note, the sources show there isn't just one single unified definition of System 3 that everyone agrees on.
Oh, okay. So different flavors.
Exactly. Different researchers emphasize different bits. Some, like Keith Stanovich's work, really focus on what he calls the reflective mind.
Reflective mind.
Yeah, the ability to sort of step back from your immediate impulses and biases to consciously override a System 1 error or to guide System 2's thinking more deliberately.
So that little voice that says, hang on, is that feeling just because I'm hungry? Or something like that.
Precisely. That's the reflective part. That other takes on System 3, which you also see in the sources, bring in the social dimension more strongly.
How so?
Like, how do we integrate social norms, our values, maybe our group identity into our decisions? That seems to go beyond just a gut reaction or a cold calculation.
Right, that feels like a higher level thing.
It does. And then there's another angle,
Yeah.
the idea that System 3 involves processes like imagination and prospection.
Thinking about the future.
Yes, actively simulating what if, running scenarios in your head based on different choices. That helps us make decisions that align with long-term goals, not just what seems best right now based on the immediate data.
Okay, so it's kind of a collection of these higher level functions. Reflecting on your own thoughts, checking them against biases, considering the social angle, imagining future outcomes, and generally keeping the whole cognitive ship steered correctly.
That's a good summary of the different ideas floating around. It sounds pretty important, doesn't it?
It really does, which I guess leads to the next big point I see coming up in these sources. When you list all those functions, monitoring, evaluating, controlling, making sure we follow through, doesn't a lot of that sound familiar? Like things cognitive science has already been talking about for ages.
You've hit the nail on the head. That's exactly where the sources go next. Are we talking about something fundamentally new here, or are we maybe just putting a new label, System 3, on concepts we already understand pretty well?
Like what kind of concept?
The two big ones that come up repeatedly are metacognition and executive functions. The sources draw really strong parallels.
Okay, let's break those down. Metacognition first. What is that exactly?
Simply put, metacognition is thinking about your own thinking.
Metathinking.
Right. It's your awareness of your own cognitive processes and your ability to monitor and control them. So things like judging how well you understand something, realizing the way you're trying to solve a problem isn't working, or deciding how much mental effort to put into a task.
So when I catch myself daydreaming during a meeting and deliberately refocus, that's metacognition, or realizing I jumped to a conclusion too fast.
Exactly. You're monitoring your internal mental state and actively adjusting your cognitive approach. And that monitoring and evaluating piece, that's a core function proposed for System 3.
Ah, I see the connection.
When System 3 is described as checking if System 1's gut feeling is okay or if System 2's analysis is sound, that sounds an awful lot like metacognitive monitoring in action.
Okay, so metacognition covers the monitoring, the self-awareness part. What about the control, the execution, the making sure it happens part?
That's where executive functions come in. And the sources really emphasize this connection. Executive functions are basically a set of top-down mental processes heavily linked to the prefrontal cortex in the brain.
The brain CEO.
That's a common analogy, yeah. They manage other cognitive functions to help us achieve goals. Key examples include things like inhibitory control.
Stopping yourself.
Yep. Suppressing automatic responses or tempting impulses, like when System 1 yells, "buy it now," and your executive function says, "hold on, let's check the budget."
Right.
Another is working memory, updating, holding information in mind, juggling it, bringing in new pieces as needed, and cognitive flexibility, or shifting, being able to switch your attention or mental approach when the situation changes.
Okay, so inhibition, working memory, flexibility. How do these specifically relate to the System 3 idea?
Well, the sources often use a typical scenario. System 1 gives you a quick answer, maybe a biased one.
Happens all the time.
System 2, if you engage it, might analyze the situation and realize, whoa, that System 1 answer is probably wrong or not the best. But just knowing it's wrong isn't enough, right?
No, you have to actually stop yourself from going with a gut feeling.
Exactly. You have to override that System 1 impulse and then implement the better solution that System 2 figured out. And that whole process, overriding the automatic, implementing the reason that's textbook executive function, inhibitory control stops the impulse, goal management and planning implement the chosen action.
Ah, okay. So System 2 does the math, figures out the right path, but it's the executive functions that actually slam the brakes on the wrong path, System 1's suggestion, and steer you onto the right one.
That's the argument presented in many of these sources. They suggest that what's being described as System 3's role here, overriding automatic thoughts, implementing reasoned plans, looks very much like a combination of System 2's analytical output working together with these well-established executive control processes.
And is there evidence for that?
Yeah, they point to research showing that people who test better on executive function tasks, or who have what psychologists call stronger thinking dispositions, basically, the tendency to actually use careful reasoning and monitor their thinking, are in fact better at overriding cognitive biases and making decisions that align with logical or rational norms.
So they're already doing what System 3 is supposed to do, using the tools we already know about.
Effectively, yes. They're exercising the kind of oversight and control that System 3 is proposed to provide, using the machinery of metacognition and executive function that cognitive science has been studying for decades.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Metacognition is the thinking about thinking monitor. Executive functions are the managing and controlling conductor. Together, they seem to cover a huge chunk of that supervisor role for System 3. But what about that other piece you mentioned earlier, the gap between deciding and actually doing? Does that also fit into these existing concepts?
It absolutely does. And this is another major parallel the sources explore. Classical economic models often just assume that once you make a rational choice, the action follows automatically. Choose option A, you do option A, done.
Huh. If only. My System 2 decides, very logically, that going for a run is a good idea.
Mm.
But my System 1 feels very, very comfortable on the couch. And my legs don't seem to get the memo automatically.
Precisely. Psychology has known about and studied this intention-action gap for a long time. We form a clear intention, I will go for a run, often based on good System 2 deliberation. But translating that intention into actual behavior, that's a whole separate battle.
What gets in the way?
Oh, lots of things. Old habits, competing impulses, like the couch example, sudden
Yeah.
changes in mood, distractions, or sometimes just forgetting your intention at the crucial moment.
So is that gap between the System 2 decision I should run and the action I am running, is that the space System 3 is supposed to bridge?
That's definitely one of the key functions people attribute to it, yes. Ensuring that the outcome of your deliberation, the intention you form, actually gets translated into concrete action out there in the world.
Okay.
But again, the sources highlight that psychologists have already developed and studied specific tools and concepts designed precisely to bridge that gap.
Such as?
Well, a really powerful one is implementation intentions. Sometimes people call it if-then planning.
If then.
Yeah. So instead of just vaguely intending I'll go for a run later, you make a very specific plan. If it's 6 p.m. and I walk through the door after work, then I will immediately change into my running clothes.
Ah, you link the intended action to a specific situational cue.
Exactly. It helps automate the initiation of the behavior, makes it less dependent on summoning up willpower in that exact moment. And speaking of willpower, the broader concept of self-regulation is key here too.
Self-control, basically.
Yeah, the ability to manage your impulses, stay focused on long-term goals, resist distractions, stick with tasks even when they're difficult or boring. These things, implementation intentions, self-regulation, goal maintenance strategies, these are the mind's existing toolkit for crossing that intention-action gap.
So the job of taking the reasoned decision from System 2 and making sure it actually happens, that's already being studied under the umbrella of self-regulation and the cognitive tools that support it.
That's the core argument from the sources, yes. They contend that much of what System 3 is proposed to do in terms of ensuring intentions lead to actions is already pretty well described within the established research on executive function and self-regulation.
Right.
These existing concepts show us that human cognition isn't just S1 popping up ideas and S2 evaluating them. There is a vital, higher-level set of processes dedicated to monitoring, managing goals, overriding impulses, and implementing the actions we choose.
Right. This is really starting to sound less like discovering a completely new system, and maybe more like finding a new name or a new way to package processes we already knew were there, which I suppose brings us right to the heart of the matter of these sources. Is this System 3 idea a genuinely original breakthrough, a paradigm shift? Or is it fundamentally an evolution of what cognitive science already understood?
And the consensus leaning out of the sources we looked at is pretty clear on this.
Yeah.
It's seen primarily as an evolutionary concept, something building on prior models, especially the dual process framework itself, rather than a revolutionary break from the past.
Okay, why are they so confident it's an evolution, not a revolution? What's the reasoning?
Well, there are several key lines of argument. First, look at where the idea often comes from. It frequently emerges directly from critiques of the original two-system model or attempts to fix its perceived
Like
limitations.
Stanovich you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Researchers like Stanovich explicitly frame their models with things like the reflective mind as extending Kahneman's framework. They're carving out a specific aspect, often pulling the more effortful, conscious reasoning and rationality monitoring out from the broader System 2 category. It's about adding detail and nuance to the existing picture, not throwing the picture away.
So they saw some functions that didn't fit neatly into the original S1 or S2 boxes, and they proposed a new box, or maybe a subdivision of the S2 box.
That's a good way to put it.
Uh,
Second, the sources point out that the people proposing a System 3 are almost always drawing heavily on existing research from lots of different areas,
like what?
like social psychology research on norms and identity, neuroscience work on how we simulate the future, decades of research on self-control and willpower. They're taking these known processes and phenomena.
And packaging them together under the System 3 label.
Precisely. Concepts like self-regulation, thinking about future consequences, considering your social role, following abstract rules, these all have their own long, deep research histories. Calling them collectively System 3 might be a useful shorthand, maybe good for teaching or creating an integrated model, but it doesn't usually involve pointing to some completely new cognitive mechanism nobody had ever thought about before.
So the substance, the actual mental activities, aren't new discoveries. It's more about the terminology, calling it System 3, and maybe the way that these activities are grouped together conceptually.
That seems to be the prevailing view in the analysis. The term System 3 itself isn't like System 1 and System 2, which have become fairly standard, widely understood terms in psychology and beyond.
Right, it's not common language yet.
No. If someone talks about System 3, they're usually referencing a specific theoretical model proposed by a particular researcher, like Webb's model, or maybe a specific paper arguing for an extension of dual process theory. These are novel frameworks or models, for sure, but the sources emphasize they are explicitly built on top of the foundation laid by decades of prior work on intuition, reasoning, metacognition, and executive control. They didn't just appear out of nowhere.
And you also mentioned earlier there isn't even one single agreed-upon definition of what System 3 is.
That's right. The sources really highlight this diversity. Different proponents emphasize different aspects. For some, it's mainly about that reflective capacity overriding biases. For others, it's more about integrating social or moral factors. For others, still, it's about future projection and planning.
That lack of a unified definition.
It does further suggest that it's maybe less about identifying one single newly discovered cognitive system with clear boundaries and more about various researchers trying to conceptually integrate these important higher-level cognitive functions that didn't seem to fit perfectly or comfortably within the original S1, S2 split.
Okay, so pulling all this together then,
Yeah.
after wading through these different perspectives in the sources, what's the final verdict? Where do we stand on this proposed System 3?
I think the main takeaway is that the underlying idea, the concept of a higher level cognitive layer operating above basic intuition and deliberation makes a lot of sense conceptually.
It feels right, intuitively.
It does. It aligns with our subjective experience that human thinking isn't just a simple two-step process. There really does seem to be a kind of hierarchy. You've got the automatic reactions, then the more deliberate analysis, but then kind of overseeing that, there's this capacity for abstract thought, reflection, setting long-term goals, bringing in our values, maintaining a sense of who we are in a social context.
It feels like there needs to be something handling all that complex, very human stuff.
And the sources suggest there is. That highest level, whether you want to call it the reflective mind or executive control or the deliberative system when you separate it from just algorithmic processing, or in some specific models, System 3, it seems both plausible and necessary to explain the full spectrum of human behavior.
Especially the really complex parts.
Exactly. Things like sticking to a tough long-term plan, like saving for retirement, or resisting strong social pressure to do something you feel is wrong, or just making sure your day-to-day actions actually line up with your core principles. That high-level oversight seems crucial. And this aligns beautifully with well-established concepts like Stanovich's work on rationality, the research on metacognition, and studies of volitional control or willpower.
But the big caveat, the caution that comes through is
That just slapping a new label, System 3, onto these functions, mainly for integration or emphasis, without really solid evidence that it represents a fundamentally distinct cognitive architecture with unique explanatory power.
Well, it risks just being a relabeling exercise.
Not adding much new understanding.
Potentially, yes.
Hmm.
And the sources reiterate that right now, a three-system model isn't the standard consensus view across cognitive science. It's more like a collection of theoretical proposals, or maybe a useful conceptual tool that certain authors use to shine a spotlight on these vital, higher-level aspects of decision-making that go beyond just gut feeling versus cold logic.
Things like wisdom or social intelligence or foresight.
Exactly, those richer aspects.
So for System 3 to really gain traction and become widely accepted like S1 and S2, what would need to happen? Researchers would need to present compelling evidence, generally agreed upon, that this System 3 corresponds to a distinct set of processes or maybe even a neural architecture that genuinely explains things beyond what we can already account for with our current understanding of System 1, System 2, metacognition, and executive functions.
That's a high bar.
It is. And until that happens, the sources suggest the most accurate way to think about these System 3 proposals is as an evolution of thought, a way people are trying to extend the popular dual process framework to better incorporate these additional layers of cognitive complexity, building very much on the rich foundation of existing psychological and brain science.
Okay, so let's bring it home. What's the practical insight here? So what, for you listening right now, what's the actionable knowledge we should take away from this deep dive into System 3?
I think the ultimate point, the really crucial insight, is that being effective, making good decisions, behaving rationally, achieving your goals, it isn't just about having sharp intuitions or being good at logical reasoning.
It's more than just S1 and S2.
Much more. It's fundamentally about this higher level oversight. It's about developing the ability to monitor your own thinking. That's metacognition. It's knowing when it's smart to trust your fast System 1 gut and when you absolutely need to slow down and engage your careful System 2 brain.
Managing the interplay.
Exactly. And maybe most critically, it's about having the executive control and the self-regulation skills, the willpower, the planning abilities to make sure that your well-reasoned intentions actually get translated into the actions and outcomes you want out there in the real world. That meta-level awareness and control, that seems absolutely vital.
Right. Okay, so here's a final thought for you to chew on as you reflect on your own decision-making after listening to this. Given how closely these proposed functions of System 3 seem to map onto things we already study, like executive functions and self-regulation, does simply knowing about the idea of a third system, does labeling it actually help you monitor or control your own decisions in a meaningful way?
Interesting question.
Or is the real challenge, the ongoing work for all of us, still the more practical, maybe less glamorous task of actively trying to develop and strengthen those underlying skills? The metacognitive awareness, the impulse control, the ability to plan and follow through, regardless of what specific theoretical box we put them in. Something to mull over next time you face a tough choice, or find yourself struggling to turn a good intention into action.